So my name's Katherine Trebeck and I'm based in the Scotland office of Oxfam, but technically I'm part of Oxfam GB's global research team. And I've got a role where I'm really exploring what sort of economy we need to get us into a space that's below planetary boundaries, but where we're lifting people above a social foundation. So looking at things like business models, different measures of progress, how we do the economy, how we do jobs, how we do decision making, all sorts of fun stuff. So I grew up in Canberra in Australia, which is the capital city, as people, almost everyone knows. I do remember at one point in an economics class challenging one of our economics teachers because she was telling us about less developed countries and more developed countries and developed countries. And I challenged her on that. I said, yes, but just because they're not economically developed doesn't mean they're lower down or anything. And so we managed for the whole year to insert the word less economically developed. And so sort of looking back from the work I do now, there must have been some sort of hints of restlessness and frustration about that narrow box of describing something purely by the economy. Yeah, but it was a really lovely, very safe childhood. Canberra's a very safe place to grow up. Quite politically engaged household, obviously all the politics going on in Canberra. As soon as I finished school, pretty much the day after I finished my studies, I got on a plane to come to the UK to do a gap year. Went backpacking around Ireland. And towards the end of that year, this was really just between school and university, I, on my own, came up to Scotland. And despite having been to all these incredible countries around Europe, having spent a long time exploring Ireland earlier that year, coming to Scotland felt like home, which I was a bit self-conscious about for a long time, but there was something that really spoke to me in Scotland. It was just really special. So I went back to Australia, went to Melbourne to do my degrees and threw myself into university and college there, but I still had this niggling, got to get back to Scotland, got to get back to Scotland. And so while my friends were at the pub, I was at my desk trying to arrange an exchange year. So I did some time at Stirling University. Actually, my university had a one-off exchange to Glasgow University, and I thought, well, I'm living in a big city, I want to go somewhere smaller. But it turned out between finishing at Stirling and starting again at Melbourne, I had 3 or 4 months spare. And I thought, well, I've really just done that backpacking thing around Europe. I'm not really ready to do that again. I want to do something useful with that chunk of time that had opened up. And so after a lot of research and a few false starts, I managed to find a place to go and spend some time working in Cameroon, in West Africa, and spent a couple of months working in a tiny little village there in a hospital, just probably not being that useful really, but learning a lot and really experiencing life in a tiny African village. And that changed really what I wanted to do career-wise, the sort of subjects I was interested in at university. But then when I came back to Melbourne, it was still Scotland. It was still Scotland on my mind, yeah.
What spoke to you in that experience in Cameroon in particular?
So it was something really about the wanting to focus on work with communities. And when I went, I was studying all sorts of subjects around international trade and big sort of geopolitical subjects, and I continued those subjects for my semester at Stirling University. And then the Cameroonian time, and then back to Australia, I started to be interested in subjects around human rights and so on. And it was just really spending time with people in this fairly poor little village in Cameroon, seeing how hard the women worked, seeing how fragile people's lives were, that made me think there's got to be something more than having an ambition to do trade negotiations. And so when I was back in Melbourne, about 2 weeks actually after returning from Cameroon, I was back to my studies, picking up really where I left off. There were a huge flood decimated that village where I'd been working in Cameroon. And I was distraught because this for me wasn't just yet another charity ad on TV of poor kids, donate money. These were people I knew, these were friends that I'd made over the last few months. And so my first instinct was get on a plane, get back there and just help out. Fill sandbags, do something was the instinct. And I had an incredible lecturer at the time. She was teaching human rights in Southeast Asia, a real activist. And I talked to her about this, and she actually said, look, Katherine, don't be stupid. If you do that, you'll get in the way. Stay here, do as much education as you possibly can, and start to work and change the system that leaves communities like the one in Cameroon vulnerable. And that was quite a shift for me. And from that, I ended up changing a bit of my focus, ended up doing getting really interested really in the role of businesses and the power of companies, and did an honours thesis looking at this emerging idea of corporate citizenship, and then discovered that I wasn't really ready to stop asking questions about the role of business and powerful companies in society. And through various coincidences, I had an opportunity to take those questions forward by actually moving back to Canberra to do a PhD, looking at Rio Tinto, big, massive mining company, looking at their relationships with Aboriginal communities around their mine sites, and asking questions about how those communities could exert pressure, could have some sort of leverage or power over this big company and make the company change its behaviour. And I just loved that. That was, I still think, the most self-indulgent 3 years of my life, because here I was getting paid by an institution to ask questions that I found absolutely fascinating, to travel around incredible parts of Australia, places like the Pilbara in Western Australia that looks like Mars, or up to the north of Queensland, a place called Cape York, which was where they have this sort of amazing scenery, this big rolling cloud, quite phenomenal weather systems, or up to remote parts of Kakadu National Park, and ask questions about how these communities are able to impact mining companies.
So now you are based in Scotland, and you're working globally through a global organisation, and from that localised experience in Cameroon, you have really now taken that around the world. What have been some of the most challenging things about that for you personally?
It's trying to work out what's the most sensible thing to try to be doing, and I still don't think I've got that right. I'm still not sure, what's the best methodology, what's the best area to focus on. When I started the current job I'm in, there was a particular organisation that I really thought I must be working with them, and this organisation didn't reply to emails, weren't really interested in my sort of enthusiastic knocking at their door. And for a couple of weeks I found that a bit upsetting. I thought, I must be doing something wrong here. And then other doors elsewhere started opening. Other organisations said, well, we want to work with you, or some of the universities said, actually, Katherine, we've got a space here that you could be affiliated with, and we can combine the Oxfam work and the academic work. And so the challenge was making a shift to thinking, well, just following where those doors are opening, being a little bit opportunistic, but also relaxed about, following where the energy and the momentum is, rather than constantly turning back at the doors that are staying shut and fretting about those doors and what may not have been behind them. But that was once I had that realisation and sort of cut myself a bit of slack, I think that helped. That's one of the challenges. But I still think constantly in the back of my mind is this question about, is this the right sort of work? Am I pitching it at the right audiences? Am I speaking to the right people? And I don't know, and it's hard. It's not something that you can measure scientifically, but it's more a sense of things. Am I sensing that I'm making the right contribution? And also checking myself, am I doing the best? And that's probably a constant challenge, which I suspect a lot of people have in their jobs.
And you mentioned these chinks of light, which have appeared at various moments. Right now, what chinks of light do you see emerging?
In Scotland?
In Scotland and globally?
Oh, there's so many. There's so many. I mean, in terms of businesses, I think the emergence, well, it's not even the emergence, it's, I guess, a renewed enthusiasm for different types of businesses like cooperatives, which Scotland has a great history of, Robert Owen and New Lanark and so on. And actually, these are business forms that predate corporations. So it's not something new, but it's also a sort of a new awareness of how significant these businesses, different business models are. I think that's a chink of light that we need to really expand massively and make those sorts of business model the mainstream choice, but also how so many communities are setting up something as small and at one level so simple as a community garden. But on another level, they're so significant because they're a different way of spending time. It's not about going out and shopping. It's about regeneration. It's about providing for each other outside the formal market. It's about spending time together, sharing space, collective use of a bit of land. So these tiny, tiny little examples that at a glance, they're quite cute and quite sweet. But at another level, actually, they have hugely, almost radical significance because of the challenge they present to how we're used to viewing the world, or used to seeing what's important, or used to seeing what's valid as an activity. So there's those sorts of things everywhere, actually. And it's actually seeing them in that bigger picture that I'm really finding most exciting.
So for leaders like yourself, either... It's a good point. For people like yourself, working either very locally or very globally to bring about change nevertheless, what are the implications, do you think, of what you've been talking about in terms of these new forms which we need to see more of emerging?
Yeah. So I guess one of the implications is that we need more of these sorts of examples, because often so many of them exist despite the system, not because of it. So there's so many questions that are arising for me is, how much, to what extent will they just remain lovely little special examples of difference, but just on the margins? Or can we turn them around and actually start to have a proliferation of these sorts of examples to the extent that they're really starting to push norms and change our understanding of the mainstream, change the conventional wisdom? And I think partly that's a time thing, but it's also a numbers thing. But it's also how we talk about these sorts of examples. Do we see them as pioneers, or do we see them as rather cute little examples of things that people do on their Saturday afternoons? Or do we see them as actually pioneering system change? So I think part of the implication is having those bigger conversations around what do these mean for how we do the system, if you like. Yeah.
Is there anything else that you'd like to add to complete this story?
I guess the work that I'm doing is to best as possible I can, driven by what we learn from the communities that we work with. So it comes from talking to folk across Scotland and hearing different stories and different accounts of how their lives are and the challenges in those lives, and trying to tie that all together into an analysis of what's happening at a macro level. So it's very much informed by the evidence that comes from communities and families and individuals, but trying to weave that together with sort of a wider evidence base, almost triangulate it, going back to my sort of researcher days, but sort of triangulate that so we understand what's happening at a macro level, and then we can start to talk about wider shifts that are needed. But constantly, to the best I can, it's very much grounded in the evidence that comes from the communities, not just from books or other people's reports.
Katherine, thank you. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Pleasure.
Thank you.